In the annals of history, there are stories that shock us, that move us, that force us to confront the darkest corners of the human experience. Today, we delve into one such story. Welcome to a journey that will take us back in time, to a chapter that many would prefer to forget, but we must remember. This is the harrowing truth about slave-breeding farms. Brace yourself as we uncover the untold stories, the unheard voices, and the unbearable realities of a past that continues to echo into our present. Stay with us as we shed light on the shadows of history. Everybody is familiar with the word plantation. A slave plantation was an agricultural farm that used enslaved people for labor. Though this practice was later abolished sometime in the 19th century, the economy of America prospered on its wings. During this period, violence was the order of the day. An overseer is set to manage activities on the plantation. He could be seen as a haunting figure that could be cold in different ways, or a loose cannon of cruelty and wanting violence. Any enslaved person can be favored by the master and set against the rest to watch over them as drivers, earning them the hate of others. With this structure in place, the slave plantation thrived. Slave breeding was a common practice adopted by Americans centuries ago. We all know breeding entails reproduction, hence, slave breeding, just as the name implies, was a practice adopted by enslavers to force the reproduction of slaves to increase their profits systematically. So you might wonder, how did this hideous tradition come into practice? Well, that curiosity would be satisfied in the course of this video. The transatlantic slave trade began in the middle of the 15th century, as Portuguese ships sailed down the West African coast intending to trade gold for spices. But the travelers encountered a more valuable commodity, humans. Over time, the slave trade became a norm and was adopted all over Europe, which led to the widespread practice of plantation owners who adopted enslaved people for labor. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar were the exports building the economy of the United States, and all these were acquired through slave labor. Thus, slavery and the slave trade became the backbone of the economy in the 18th century. However, in 1807, Christian groups under the leadership of a man named William Wilberforce pushed for the slave trade to be abolished. The movement was embraced by the United States Congress, and the Atlantic slave trade abolishment was passed into law, making it an illegal practice. The prohibition on importing enslaved people into the United States of America resulted in a limited supply in the country. Unfortunately, this happened at a time when the United States was undergoing a rapid expansion of cotton, sugarcane, and rice production in the Deep South. The invention of the cotton gin at that time enabled the cultivation of short staple cotton to be highly profitable. This led to the domination of cotton plantations throughout the Deep South. Remember, the cultivation of this commodity was solely dependent on slave labor, and with the abolishment of the international slave trade, enslavers could no longer traffic people from the coast of Africa. With the increased labor demand, plantations in the United States looked into other means to maintain their economic strength. They resorted to protecting their slave stock by breeding their own slaves. The internal market of slave breeding enabled the country to maintain its economic strength, as enslavers would coerce enslaved men and women to procreate and produce more slaves. The terms breeders and breeding slaves became familiar to people. The slaveholders actively encouraged their enslaved property to reproduce either by cajoling, threatening, or coercing them into intimate relationships in an attempt to control their growth. They would then supervise the exercise and diet of children produced from these sexual relationships in an attempt to control their growth and raise them as laborers and commodities to be sold on the market. The children born of relationships forced by slaveholders were kept under the watchful eye of their enslavers. They were often taken away from their parents and placed in big houses, where they were utilized as domestic slaves so as to keep a close eye on them. Many enslavers carry out the feeding regime by forcing these children to eat from long troughs similar to those used to feed livestock. In this way, slaveholders systematically controlled what and when the children ate. Slaveholding women also gave the children medicine, such as Jerusalem oak, to cure parasites like worms, and forced them to run around to ascertain their fitness. All of which was done to ensure that the children grew up to fit the specifications of the labor intended for them to carry out. Many enslaved girls and boys were singled out as potential productive producers and reproducers like their parents, who were forced to reproduce the labor force. Sometimes slaveholders would force mothers and fathers to witness their children experience the same violent and traumatic ordeals they endured. The systematic breeding of slaves got extreme to the point of forcing incest upon slave families. Hoods and bags were given to slaves to cover their heads. This keeps them from knowing who they are forced to have intercourse with. It could be someone they know, perhaps a niece, sister, aunt, or even their own mother in some cases. The breeders only wanted a child that could be sold to make a profit and maintain their slave stock. However, some enslaved men and women resisted this forced reproduction through reproductive resistance. They achieved this through the use of natural contraceptives, long periods of nursing, abortions, and infanticide. However, those who could not choose or were unable to carry out this resistance method witnessed the enslavers walk their children down the same dreadful path they were forcibly subjected to. Life cycle and the reproduction of life thus became a huge part of enslaved people's day-to-day lives in the mid-19th century. The essence of breeding farms initially was to produce as many enslaved people as possible for sale and distribution throughout the South to meet the increase in demand. Two of the largest slave farms were in Maryland Eastern Shore and Richmond, Virginia. These two, among many others, ensured the circulation of slave stock throughout the Deep South. With the increased demand for enslaved people and reproduction being the far-fetched solution, enslaved women were seen as both producers and reproducers of slavery. These women were referred to as breeding women, attracting a higher price value in the market due to their fertility and reproductive capability. However, some enslavers preferred to avoid purchasing particularly fertile women, as they could not labor as productively in the fields due to their pregnant state, and were reduced to what was known as a half hand rather than a full hand. However, others saw potential in fertile women and valued women who produced many children. They see their natural increased potential as a means of reproducing the workforce, thus increasing the number of enslaved people that would later be sold or exploited through labor. The value of these women varies considerably at auctions, depending on whether enslavers see them as the creators of potential lives and profit or liability on the fields. Slaveholding women particularly placed a high value on breeding women and purchased them intending to exploit their future increase. When you think about farms and plantations, planting, watering, and harvesting are probably what comes to mind. However, there are numerous other types of labor done by enslaved people on plantations. Enslaved people also cleared lands, slaughtered livestock, cut and hauled wood, dug ditches, and repaired buildings and tools. In addition to these, they also work as mechanics, carpenters, drivers, blacksmiths, and in some other skilled trades. Enslaved women additionally carry the burden of their families by cooking and taking care of the children. They also engage in some leisure activities that include weaving, spinning, and sewing. Other slaves, personally designated to their masters, engaged in domestic work and were often referred to as house servants. Though on the surface their work appears to be easier compared to the field slaves, it is not like that in the real sense. They were constantly under the scrutiny of their masters and could be called on for services at any time. In addition to this unrest, they had far less privacy than those who worked in the fields. In a plantation where humans employ other humans for labor, there would always be means to establish control and discipline. The drivers, overseers, and masters were responsible for plantation discipline, and slaves were punished for several reasons. They could be punished for not working fast enough, defying authority, being late to the fields, running away, and many other reasons you can only imagine. The punishment took many forms, including shackling, branding, imprisonment, torture, whipping, mutilation, and being sold away. Sometimes slaves were even murdered. Although some masters were more benevolent than others and punished their slaves less often or severely, there were rare exceptions where the masters would decide to take the lives of their slaves. Breeding farms were created to forcibly increase the population of enslaved people, as enslaved men were forced to sleep with their daughters or mothers, with the punishment for refusal being death. Another common method employed to control and punish these slaves, particularly enslaved men, was buck-breaking. This method entails stripping and sexually assaulting enslaved men to cripple their ego and strength, causing some to commit suicide as they couldn't bear to live with the shame. This practice became so successful to the point that it grew into sex farms, where enslaved men were bred for the purpose of being sexually assaulted by their white masters. Enslavers created some codes of ethics, called slave codes, to exert control and maintain a firm authoritarian relationship with slaves. Even though the codes varied slightly from state to state, the basic idea remains that enslaved people were considered mere property, not people, and should be treated as such. Other statements attached to this gruesome code includes that slaves couldn't testify in court against their masters. That is, their testimony was inadmissible in court in any litigation involving their masters. Also, they couldn't make any contract or buy and sell goods, neither could they own property, and they couldn't strike a white person even if it was in self-defense, in response to an attack. With no fundamental human right or freedom of identity or self, what it felt like to be enslaved is better left to your imagination. As if these weren't enough, numerous restrictions were imposed to enforce social control. Among them include the fact that slaves could not stay away from their owner's premises without permission. They couldn't gather or assemble unless a white person were present. They couldn't own firearms nor any anti-slavery literature. They couldn't be taught to read or write, nor were they permitted to marry. In addition, the killing of an enslaved person was rarely regarded as murder, nor was the sexual assault of a slave woman seen as trespassing. With these horrible codes, you can only imagine the cruelty experienced by enslaved people from their respective owners. Whenever there was a slave insurrection or even the rumor of one, the laws became even tighter. The patrols were set up to enforce the codes as well as maintain orderliness and control. These patrols were similar to militias and were made up of white men obligated to serve for a set period. Enslaved people aren't mere property or commodities, but human beings with families, cultures, and history. Treating them solely as sources of labor perpetuated a system of exploitation and dehumanization, with lasting impacts on American society. You would agree with me that those slave codes are bizarre and inhumane. What part of this video did you find most interesting? The origin of how slave breeding came into existence, breeding women, or the punishment methods adopted by slavers? Let us know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.